I have spent 41 years measuring things that didn't want to be measured. Thermal gradients in the Sketh Nebula. Protein folding variants in extremophile colonies at 200 atmospheres. The precise moment a Vorath calving pod detects vibration and pivots toward its parent, 41 milliseconds, in case you're curious, and no, I didn't enjoy the fieldwork. I have reduced things that looked like mysteries to columns of clean data, and I have never once apologized for it. So when the interspecies cognitive accord asked me to board the Ethan's Reach and produce a formal attachment coefficient study on a human-Earth pet bonding pair, I said yes the same way I say yes to everything, without ceremony, and with a carry-on bag of instruments that cost more than the average junior researcher earns in a year. I want to be precise about what the accord was actually asking for. The galaxy had developed, over several centuries of interspecies contact, a reasonably thorough taxonomy of animal pair bonds. There were protective utility bonds, a working animal attached to its handler for task function reasons. There were territorial cohabitation bonds, two organisms sharing space because the metabolic cost of expulsion exceeded the metabolic cost of tolerance. There were kin-adjacent imprint bonds, there were resource exchange bonds, and there were several categories of what the Vorath call Shethavar, which translates roughly as bonded for no measurable reason and therefore suspect. Human pet bonds had not, prior to my study, been formally classified. The prevailing assumption among the Accord's member species was that they were a variant of the protective utility category. Humans used their animals for work, then anthropomorphized the relationship for psychological comfort. Straightforward. Box ticked. Move on. I boarded the Ethan's Reach at Tessin Way Station on a Tuesday. My subject was a junior cartographer named Reyes, 26, quiet, the sort of person who answers questions in complete sentences and doesn't volunteer extra words. She had been aboard the vessel for 14 months. She had brought, at embarkation and over the documented objections of 3 separate Accord compliance officers, one 8-year-old male beagle named Ptolemy. Ptolemy weighed 14 kilograms. He had a white chest, a brown and black saddle, one ear slightly longer than the other, and the expression of a magistrate who has heard this particular argument before and found it unpersuasive. He moved slowly. He smelled, according to the Ethan's Reach Soluvan biosensor array, of something the array's translation matrix rendered as warm grain with organic complexity. The array had flagged this reading 3 times over 14 months because it had no established olfactory category for it and kept assuming sensor error. I set up my instruments in the observation annex adjoining Reyes's quarters and introduced myself to both of them. Ptolemy looked at me the way he looked at everything, with complete, untroubled patience, as though I were a weather event that would eventually pass. I began with cortisol mapping. The standard protective utility bond produces an elevated cortisol baseline in the animal during handler absence intervals, indicating stress load consistent with task anxiety. I ran a 12-hour separation protocol, Reyes at her station, Ptolemy in the annex with me and the instruments. His cortisol reading was not low. It was, as best I could determine, absent. The sensor flagged instrument error. I recalibrated. It flagged it again. I ran a secondary assay on a blood draw sample that Ptolemy tolerated by sighing and resting his chin on my knee. The assay confirmed what the sensor had found. He was not stressed. He was not anxious. He appeared to be, in the clinical sense, simply waiting, in the same low metabolic, unhurried state that the sensor array had been misreading as a malfunction for 14 months. I noted this and moved on. The proximity preference test is designed to distinguish utility bond from effective bond. You introduce the subject animal to 3 handlers, the primary bonded human, a familiar secondary human, and an unfamiliar human. A utility animal distributes proximity preference according to who most recently issued a task-relevant cue. An effective bonded animal orients to the primary human regardless. Ptolemy, when Reyes entered the annex at the end of her shift, walked to her in a straight line, sat on her feet, and did not move for 3 hours. This is not unusual for an effective bond. What was unusual was the readout from the Ethan's Reach-S ambient biosensor network, a Saluvan-manufactured array calibrated to monitor stress indicators across all 47 crew species simultaneously, for medical early warning purposes. The moment Ptolemy settled on Reyes's feet, stress load readings across 11 non-human crew members dropped an average of 8%. The Saluvan chief medical officer, whose name I cannot reproduce in standard script, messaged me that evening to ask if I had introduced a pharmaceutical aerosol into the ventilation system. I had not. I ran that test twice more over the following week. The result was consistent. Ptolemy settling on Reyes's feet reduced ambient stress indicators for crew members who were not in the same compartment, had no line of sight to the annex, and in at least 2 cases, had never directly encountered the dog. The biosensor array, designed to detect 1,100 distinct stress biomarkers across 47 species, did not have a column for whatever Ptolemy was producing. It simply stopped flagging the readings as errors on day 9 and began logging them under a header the array's maintenance AI had apparently generated autonomously, ambient unclassified stabilization event. I want to be honest about the point at which my methodology began to struggle. It was not the cortisol absence. It was not the proximity preference result, which was, taken in isolation, merely a strong effective bond reading. It was the morning of day 11, when I arrived at the annex at 0600 and found Ptolemy already there, asleep across the threshold of Reyes's cabin door. She was inside, asleep. He was outside, asleep. The door was closed. The corridor was empty and cold and lit by the flat blue of overnight running lights. And Ptolemy was lying across the threshold with his chin on his paws and his eyes shut, and the Ethan's Reach-S biosensor array had been logging, since approximately 0230, a continuous ambient stabilization event covering decks 3 through 6. He wasn't guarding. There was nothing to guard against. He was simply located at the nearest point to her that the geometry of the ship permitted while she slept, and he was asleep himself, and whatever it was that he produced, whatever the array was logging as an unclassified stabilization event, it was running continuously, all night, without effort, because that was, as far as I could determine, simply what he was. I sat down on the corridor floor next to him with my back against the bulkhead and my tablet on my knee, and I stayed there for a while. He opened one eye, registered me, and closed it again. "I have a taxonomy problem," I told him. He didn't answer, because he is a dog. I filed my report to the Accord on the morning of day 21. The methodology section is thorough. The data appendices run to 63 pages. The attachment coefficient field, which the Accord's standard template provides a single drop-down menu to complete, protective utility, territorial cohabitation, kin-adjacent imprint, resource exchange, or Shethavar, contains a manual override entry, because none of the menu options were correct. The entry reads, "See attached." The attached addendum is 4 pages. The short version is this: the bond does not fit the taxonomy because the taxonomy was written before the galaxy had occasion to meet it. The Beagle is not attached to the human for utility, territory, resource, kinship, or any reason the framework has a column for. He is attached to her in the way that a fixed point is fixed, not because something is holding it in place, but because that is what it is. Remove the utility, remove the task, remove the handler function, and the bond does not reduce. It stays. It runs at the same amplitude whether she is 5 meters away behind a closed door or in the room with him. The Accord's review committee sent a follow-up query asking me to clarify what category I was proposing. I wrote back that I was not proposing a category. I was noting the absence of one. The committee has since convened 3 working groups. I am told this is progress. Reyes, when I said goodbye on the docking ramp at Tezsign, shook my hand. Ptolemy sat beside her and looked at me with the magistrate expression. I told him the data were interesting. He accepted this without visible emotion, which I respected. I have been measuring things for 41 years. I have never once been given a result I could not file. He is the first.